Good evening. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese finds himself at the centre of intense political controversy following criticism over his absence from funeral services for victims of the Bondi Junction massacre. The attack, which shocked the nation and claimed multiple lives, has now sparked a political firestorm that some commentators say could fundamentally damage the Prime Minister's standing with the Australian public. Tonight, we examine the controversy, the political fallout, and what this means for Albanese's leadership. We'll hear from critics, explore the broader context, and analyze whether this represents a turning point in Australian politics. Segment 1, The Bondi Massacre Context, 2445–215. To understand the current controversy, we must first revisit the tragic events at Bondi Junction. The attack sent shockwaves through Australia, a nation where such violent incidents remain relatively rare. Multiple victims lost their lives, families were shattered, and a community was left reeling from an act of senseless violence. In the immediate aftermath, Australians came together in grief and solidarity. Vigils were held, flowers were laid at memorials, and the nation mourned collectively. The victims came from diverse backgrounds, their lives cut short in an attack that struck at the heart of a popular Sydney shopping area during what should have been an ordinary day. The funerals for the victims became moments of profound national mourning. Families gathered to say goodbye to loved ones, communities came together to honor those lost, and the media covered these solemn occasions as the nation watched. It was during these funeral services that questions began to emerge about who was attending and, notably, who was not. Public expectations for political leadership during national tragedies run high in Australia. Prime ministers are often expected to serve as consoler-in-chief, representing the nation's grief and standing alongside those who have suffered loss. Past leaders have attended funerals, visited communities affected by disasters, and provided visible demonstrations of national unity during times of crisis. The absence of Prime Minister Albanese from the funeral services quickly became noticed. Social media commentary began questioning where the Prime Minister was and why he wasn't present. News outlets started reporting on the absence, and political opponents seized on the issue as evidence of poor judgment or misplaced priorities. Segment 2, The Political Criticism, 2:15 to 4 o'clock. Opposition politicians have been vocal in their criticism of Prime Minister Albanese's absence from the funerals. The word finished has been used by some commentators to describe the damage to his political reputation, suggesting that this controversy could mark a defining negative moment in his premiership. Critics argue that attending funerals for victims of a national tragedy represents a fundamental duty of political leadership. They contend that the Prime Minister's absence demonstrates a disconnect from the Australian public and a failure to understand the gravity of the moment. Some have questioned what could possibly have been more important than standing with grieving families and a mourning nation. Political opponents have framed the issue as symptomatic of broader concerns about Albanese's leadership style and priorities. They point to what they characterise as a pattern of being out of touch with ordinary Australians, more focused on international travel and political positioning than on domestic concerns and national unity. The timing of the criticism proves particularly damaging given existing political pressures facing the Albanese government. With various policy challenges, economic concerns, and ongoing political debates, this controversy adds another dimension to questions about the Prime Minister's judgment and effectiveness. Social media has amplified the criticism significantly. Images of empty chairs where the Prime Minister might have sat, comparisons with other leaders who did attend, and commentary about political priorities have spread rapidly online. The hashtag and online discussion have kept the controversy in the public eye far longer than a single news cycle. Some commentators have drawn comparisons with past prime ministers and their responses to national tragedies. These comparisons, whether fair or not, have reinforced the narrative that Albanese fell short of expectations during a critical moment. The contrast between his absence and what others might have done in similar circumstances has become a focal point of criticism. Segment 3, The Defense and Context, 4 to 5:45. Supporters of Prime Minister Albanese and members of his government have attempted to provide context for his absence and push back against what they characterize as politically motivated attacks during a time of national grief. Government representatives have pointed out that the Prime Minister did make statements expressing condolences, did meet with some affected families privately, and did take various actions in response to the tragedy. They argue that leadership during crisis takes many forms and that physical presence at every funeral service shouldn't be the sole measure of a leader's response. Some have noted the practical considerations involved in prime ministerial attendance at such events. Security requirements, logistical complications, and the potential for political presence to overshadow or complicate private family grief are all factors that might influence such decisions. The argument has been made that sometimes the most respectful course is to allow families space to mourn without turning funerals into political events. The timing of various commitments has also been cited as relevant context. If the Prime Minister had prior scheduled obligations, particularly those of national or international importance that couldn't easily be rescheduled, this might explain the absence. Government supporters suggest that leaders face constant competing demands on their time and must make difficult choices about where they can be most effective. Questions have been raised about whether this controversy represents genuine public concern or political opportunism by opponents looking to damage the government. The speed with which political criticism emerged and the language used, including declarations that Albanese is finished, suggest to some that this is more about political combat than sincere grief or concern. Media coverage itself has come under scrutiny, with some arguing that excessive focus on the Prime Minister's whereabouts distracts from the real issues, honoring victims, supporting survivors, and addressing whatever factors contributed to the tragedy occurring in the first place. Segment 4, Public Reaction and Polling, 5:45 to 7:15. The Australian public's response to this controversy appears divided, though measuring genuine public sentiment versus amplified social media reaction presents challenges. Anecdotal reports suggest that some Australians do feel disappointment or frustration at the Prime Minister's absence from the funerals. For these citizens, the symbolic importance of leadership presence during national tragedy outweighs any practical considerations or alternative explanations. They view attendance at such events as a non-negotiable expectation of the office. Others express more nuanced views, acknowledging the tragedy while questioning whether this controversy represents a proportionate response or political exaggeration. These Australians may feel that focus should remain on victims and prevention rather than political point scoring over attendance at funeral services. There exists also a segment of the population that sees this as manufactured controversy, politically motivated criticism that doesn't reflect the complexity of leadership decisions or the various ways a prime minister might respond to tragedy. These citizens may be more skeptical of opposition motives and media narratives. The impact on Albanese's overall approval ratings and the government's political standing remains to be fully measured. Early polling, if available, would provide some indication, though it's worth noting that public opinion can be volatile in the immediate aftermath of controversies and may settle differently over time. The electoral implications depend partly on how long this controversy persists in public consciousness. Some political controversies prove fleeting, fading once the news cycle moves on. Others become defining moments that voters remember and that opponents continue to reference. Which category this falls into will determine its lasting political impact. Regional variations in public response may also exist. Voters in Sydney and particularly in areas near Bondi Junction might have stronger reactions than those in other parts of Australia. Urban versus rural differences, existing political allegiances, and various demographic factors all influence how different segments of the population interpret and respond to such controversies. Segment 5, Broader Implications, 7:15 to 8:45. This controversy raises broader questions about political leadership, public expectations, and media coverage in modern Australia. The role of social media in amplifying and sustaining political controversies cannot be understated. What might once have been a news story that ran for a day or two now becomes sustained online discussion, with multiple perspectives, evidence, and counter-arguments circulating continuously. This changes the dynamics of political damage and recovery. Questions about authentic versus performed empathy in political leadership have become increasingly relevant. Voters have become more sophisticated and skeptical about political symbolism, yet still expect leaders to demonstrate care and connection during difficult times. Navigating these expectations proves challenging for any political leader. The opposition's strategy of using strong language like Finnish to describe Albanese's political future represents a calculated risk. If such claims prove exaggerated and the Prime Minister recovers politically, the opposition may face credibility questions about crying wolf. If the claims prove prescient, they position the opposition as having correctly identified a critical political moment. Media responsibility during national tragedies involves balancing legitimate scrutiny of political leadership with respect for grieving families and victims. Some argue that excessive focus on political controversies during such periods is unseemly and shifts attention from what truly matters. Others contend that holding leaders accountable remains important regardless of circumstances. The international context matters as well. How leaders in other nations respond to tragedies, what expectations exist in different political cultures, and what precedents exist all inform how Australians might judge their own leaders' responses. This incident may also prompt reflection on how future leaders handle similar situations. If the political cost of absence proves high, future prime ministers will likely ensure their presence at comparable events regardless of competing demands. If the controversy fades, leaders may feel they have more flexibility in how they demonstrate leadership during tragedies. Segment 6, Looking Ahead, 8:45 to 9:30. The political future for Prime Minister Albanese depends on multiple factors beyond a single controversy. His government's response to the substantive policy questions raised by the Bondi Massacre matters more in the long term than attendance at funerals. Addressing security concerns, reviewing relevant policies, and taking concrete actions to prevent future tragedies will likely prove more politically significant than symbolic gestures, however important those gestures may be in the moment. The Prime Minister's ability to directly address the controversy, explain his decisions, and demonstrate understanding of public concerns could help mitigate political damage. How and when he chooses to speak to this issue will influence whether the controversy persists or begins to fade. The opposition's sustained pressure or decision to move on to other issues will also affect the controversy's longevity. If they continue to raise this in Parliament, in media appearances, and in political advertising, it stays alive. If they shift focus, it may recede. Other political developments will inevitably emerge that compete for public attention. Economic issues, international events, domestic policy debates, and the normal rhythm of political life means that no single controversy, however intense, remains the sole focus indefinitely. Closing, 9:30 to 10 o'clock. The controversy over Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's absence from Bondi Massacre funerals represents a significant political challenge for his government. Whether it proves to be the defining moment that critics claim, marking the beginning of the end for his political reputation, or merely a temporary storm that passes, remains to be seen. What's clear is that public expectations for leadership during national tragedies remain high in Australia. Symbols matter in politics, and presence during moments of collective mourning carries weight regardless of what other actions a leader might take. The Prime Minister's supporters argue for understanding the complexities of leadership decisions, while critics insist that some duties are simply non-negotiable. For the families who lost loved ones in the Bondi Junction attack, and for the survivors still recovering, the political controversy may seem like a distraction from their grief and healing. Ultimately, honoring the victims, supporting those affected, and working to prevent future tragedies matters more than any political debate. As Australia continues to process this tragedy and its aftermath, the political dimensions will play out alongside the human ones. Whether Anthony Albanese's reputation proves truly finished as critics claim, or whether this controversy becomes merely one difficult chapter in his premiership, only time will tell. That's our analysis of this developing political story. Thank you for watching.